Hey, howdy.
It began, as most storms do, with silence. In the spring of 2025, Vanessa Paradis sat in a Paris recording studio, sunlight trembling through the blinds. The journalist asked gently, "If you could describe your years with Johnny in one sentence, what would it be?" She paused, her lips almost smiling before the sentence arrived soft. Devastating. He loved me like a storm, and I was too tired to keep rebuilding. The room fell still. It wasn't bitterness that lingered in her voice, but exhaustion, the kind that only love can cause. That single phrase, released after more than a decade of discretion, carried the weight of a vanished home, 14 years, 2 children, countless melodies written between the chaos of movie sets and the hush of French mornings. To the world, they had been the beautiful contradiction, the wild American and the grounded French muse who made family look like poetry. They were never married. And perhaps that was their rebellion, love without a contract, only instinct. But instinct, like weather, changes. Behind the myth of serenity was something quieter, more dangerous, a fatigue that came from loving someone who could not stop chasing ghosts. Johnny Depp, the man who transformed pain into performance, carried shadows that fame only sharpened. Vanessa, patient and precise, became both witness and shelter until the roof began to leak faster than she could repair it. Her words in that interview were not an accusation, but an autopsy of a bond that had been sacred, complex, and finally, unsustainable. What happens when devotion turns into survival, when a woman's tenderness becomes architecture, and she realizes she is rebuilding the same house every storm destroys? As Vanessa's voice trailed off, the sound engineer forgot to press stop. Outside, the rain started against the glass, soft at first, then insistent, as if echoing the sentence she had just spoken. That was the moment the world finally understood. Their story was never about a breakup. It was about how love itself can become a weather system, beautiful, consuming, and impossible to live inside forever. In the late 1990 seconds, the world still believed in the magic of opposites. He was the restless boy from Kentucky who had turned his loneliness into characters, pirates, poets, madmen. She was the French girl with a velvet voice, who made melancholy sound like honey. When Johnny Depp met Vanessa Paradis in 1998, something rare happened. The storm found a shoreline. They met in Paris, at a hotel by the river. She wore black. He noticed the simplicity before the beauty. "The first thing I saw was her back," he would later say. And then she turned. And I knew, in that turn, something inside him quieted. For the first time in years, the noise of Hollywood, its parties, its demands, its applause fell away. Vanessa became the calm he didn't know he needed. She was not dazzled by his fame. She was intrigued by his silences. He followed her to France, trading chaos for cobblestones, the red carpet for the rhythm of the Seine. They bought a farmhouse in the south, where they could disappear. For 14 years, they lived between languages, between worlds, the old Hollywood rebel and the French chanteuse who preferred family over fame. To the public, they were the embodiment of a secret dream, 2 artists who had escaped the machinery of celebrity to create their own universe. Their love was the quiet kind, unannounced, unbranded. They had no wedding rings, no glossy covers proclaiming forever. But what they had seemed stronger: children, music, laughter over coffee, drawings taped to the kitchen walls. In interviews, Johnny spoke of her with reverence. "She saved me," he once told a friend. "She gives me a reason to come home." Vanessa, when asked, would simply smile. He's a poet who doesn't know he's writing. But love, even the sacred kind, carries its contradictions. Johnny's art came from edges, from places of intensity, extremes, and darkness. He thrived on transformation, on the adrenaline of becoming someone else. Vanessa, by contrast, built her world on continuity. She was the steady flame, not the spark. She believed love was something you tended to like a garden, or a song you returned to each night until it found its shape. At first, those differences felt like complement, not conflict. She gave him roots, he gave her fire. But time, patient and merciless, began to expose the imbalance. When one person becomes the lighthouse, and the other the ship chasing storms, both eventually grow weary, one from wandering, the other from waiting. He worked endlessly, film after film, project after project, searching for something that even he couldn't name. She wrote music in French, often alone, recording late at night after the children were asleep. Sometimes she would leave her lyrics on the piano, knowing he might find them in the morning. Tu dors dans l'ombre, je veille dans la lumière. She once wrote, "You sleep in the shadows, I keep watch in the light." Friends noticed how they protected their privacy fiercely. It wasn't a strategy, it was survival. Fame is a thief of peace, of intimacy, of truth. They knew that if they opened the door even a little, the world would devour what was still fragile between them. So they locked it. Inside that locked world, though, the air began to thin. Johnny's inner storms, the insomnia, the restlessness, the need for danger started to return. Fame, that old addiction, called again. The very energy that made him brilliant on screen was the same energy that made him volatile in real life. Vanessa, ever patient, tried to build around it. She moved quietly, the way people do when they love someone unpredictable. In the early 2000s, when journalists asked why they never married, she laughed lightly. Marriage is just paper. Love is proof enough. It was true, but perhaps it was also a prophecy. Love without boundaries is beautiful until it begins to spill over. They created a home filled with music and art, but also unspoken tension. Johnny, who loved grand gestures, would fill the house with roses after a fight. Vanessa would clean them up days later, wilted and fragrant, their petals sticking to the floorboards. There was affection, tenderness and fatigue. A pattern began to repeat. Head retreat into work, shed retreat into silence. Both, in their own ways, trying to protect the children from the weather of their love. Two outsiders. They looked serene, the perfect European fairy tale. But those close to them could sense the fracture lines. She was always holding things together, a friend once said, and he was always trying to reinvent what they already had. By 2011, the equilibrium had shifted. The distance between them wasn't anger, it was accumulation of missed birthdays, long nights apart, promises delayed. Vanessa began to understand that the man she loved was also the man who needed to lose himself to feel alive, and she could no longer follow him there. Still, she stayed longer than most would have. She believed that love, real love, was a long endurance, a practice, not a passion. She told a confidant, "He's not cruel. He's just haunted." In the end, there was no betrayal, no single act of destruction. There was only erosion. The tide came in, again and again, and the foundation she had built carefully, lovingly began to wash away. The illusion, though beautiful, was complete to the world. They were proof that fame and family could coexist. Behind closed doors, they were simply two artists fighting different battles under the same roof. And so, before the storm broke, they both smiled for one last photograph, she in black, he in his hat, the children between them. The camera captured light, not weather. But that light, Vanessa later said, was already fading when the shutter clicked. The greatest loneliness is the one that lives inside love. For years, Vanessa had lived beside a man whose world could change with a single role, whose every emotion could become art, but rarely conversation. She had learned to read silence the way others read weather, by the smell of the air, the tension before a storm. In the beginning, it had almost felt romantic, the darkness that came after each project, the melancholy that settled when the camera stopped rolling. She believed it was the price of genius. Some souls, she once told a friend, need turbulence to breathe. But over time, the turbulence became constant. What once felt like mystery began to feel like distance. Johnny's moods swung like a pendulum between tenderness and withdrawal. On good days, he was luminous, writing, painting, cooking for the children, playing guitar until the house vibrated with laughter. On others, he disappeared into himself, unreachable even when he sat across from her. Fame had made him visible to everyone and accessible to no one. Vanessa's love for him was patient. But patience, too, can run dry. She started to feel the fatigue of being the steady one, the lighthouse that never moved. The children would come to her with their small fears, their father's absences. When will Papa come home? And she would answer with the gentleness of someone who knows the truth but refuses to wound. Soon, my love. He's working? Inside, she wondered if work was the only place he could feel safe. At night, she wrote songs that were less about love and more about endurance. Her lyrics, soft and elliptical, carried the sin of resignation. I hold the door open, but the wind never enters. The melodies were fragile, like glass on the edge of breaking. Johnny, too, was unraveling in his own way. The more she tried to anchor him, the more he drifted. The shadow that followed him from childhood poverty, rejection, the need to prove himself had never truly left. He chased intensity because calm frightened him. It reminded him of the silence he had known as a boy. He needed storms to confirm he was still alive. Vanessa understood this perhaps too well. She didn't try to fix him. She tried to love him through it. But loving someone's darkness is a slow form of self-erasure. Each time she forgave, she lost a little more of her own color. She became careful with words, avoiding anything that might ignite the storm. Love, once expansive, began to shrink into management schedules, boundaries, emotional triage. They communicated through gestures more than speech. He would send her a song from a hotel room at 2 a.m. or a sketch of their daughter with a note that said, I miss home. She would reply with a photograph of the morning light on the terrace. No caption needed. It was love. Yes, but coded. Fragile. Forever on the edge of translation. When they were together, time felt suspended. They would cook, dance barefoot in the kitchen, tell stories to the children. Head call her my compass. Shed laugh, knowing how easily compasses spin. Yet even in these moments, she sensed the imbalance. She was always holding space for two. Her therapist once asked her, "Why do you stay?" Vanessa smiled sadly. Because when he's kind, the world feels rewritten. That was the truth and the trap. Love had become both medicine and addiction. Each reconciliation felt like sunrise after a long storm. Each relapse like a familiar drowning. As years passed, the house began to hold ghosts of arguments never resolved. The walls absorbed every apology, every whispered plea to start over. The children grew, learning early that love could be both a lullaby and a warning. The hardest part wasn't his temper or absences, it was the unpredictability. Vanessa could handle pain, she could not handle chaos. She had been raised in rhythm melody, repetition, harmony, Johnny lived in improvisation highs and crashes. Their love had no shared tempo anymore. She began to feel the ache of disappearing inside her own life. The songs she wrote were never recorded. Her reflection in mirrors felt less like herself and more like the echo of a woman who once believed she could calm the sea. There were moments of clarity. One evening, while helping her daughter with homework, she realized she hadn't spoken to Johnny in 3 days. He was somewhere filming, lost in a character again. The phone buzzed with messages from reporters. Rumors. Noise. She turned it off and looked at her child, the quiet steadiness of her eyes. I need to build a home that doesn't move, she thought. The next morning, she wrote in her journal, love cannot be both rescue and residence. In the following months, they tried again vacations, dinners, new routines, but every calm was temporary. The storm, like a loyal friend, always returned. Johnny would apologize with sincerity, promising to be still. And for a while, he would be. But silence frightened him more than chaos. Stillness meant confrontation with himself. Vanessa stopped waiting for change. Instead, she began to mourn while still inside the relationship, a quiet, invisible grief. She grieved the laughter, the shared beginnings, the version of him who had once believed peace was possible. Sometimes she would watch him sleep and wonder, is he dreaming of me? Or of freedom? Her friends told her she was too forgiving. But forgiveness, for Vanessa, wasn't weakness, it was language. She forgave because she understood. But understanding, she realized, doesn't heal you, it only explains why you bleed. There was one night, near the end, when the rain came hard against the windows. Johnny sat on the floor with his guitar, playing a melody so sorrowful it felt like confession. She sat on the couch, listening, unable to cry. When the song ended, he looked up at her and said, "You're the only thing that's ever made sense." And she whispered, "Then why do you keep losing it?" He had no answer. It wasn't anger that finally separated them, it was exhaustion. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that arrives like fog and never leaves. She woke one morning and felt it clearly. She had nothing left to rebuild with. The house was still standing, but her heart had quietly moved out. And yet, even as she left, she didn't hate him. You cannot hate the storm that taught you how to swim. For years afterward, Vanessa avoided speaking about their love. She wanted to protect what little truth remained unsaid. Until, one day in that Paris studio, she let the words escape. He loved me like a storm, and I was too tired to keep rebuilding. It wasn't a confession. It was a eulogy not for the man, but for the woman she had been inside his weather. There is a silence that arrives after truth, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that clarifies. When Vanessa spoke those words in 2025, the world heard them as a confession. But to her, they were an ending already long accepted. What the public perceived as closure had, in reality, been lived quietly years before. In the months following their separation, she did what most women do after a long war of emotion. She rebuilt in miniature. New home, smaller, quieter. Morning rituals returned, coffee at dawn, a notebook open by the window, her guitar leaning nearby. The children's laughter filled the space once occupied by arguments and apologies. She did not erase him from their lives. She merely refused to let him be the center of it anymore. Meanwhile, Johnny continued moving from set to set, city to city. His art remained electric, his performances deeper, darker. The storm had not left him, it had simply changed address. In interviews, when asked about Vanessa, his voice would soften. She was my compass. I still look for her light. Vanessa heard that once. by accident, on the radio while driving through Saint Germain. She pulled over and listened, her hands trembling. It wasn't pain, she felt it was recognition. They had become two parallel truths. He loved her, the only way he knew. And she left the only way she could. The revelation, she realized, was not about betrayal or guilt. It was about compatibility that love, however sincere, cannot heal what refuses to be still. He was born for motion, she for roots. The very traits that drew them together eventually tore them apart. There was no grand finale, no shouting, no final scene for cameras. The real ending took place one morning in the south of France. The sky was pale blue, the air heavy with rain. She was making coffee when he walked into the kitchen, unshaven, barefoot, exhausted from another sleepless night. They stood facing each other, years of words trapped between them. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "You're not," she replied gently. "You're just being you." He looked at her then, really looked not as the mother of his children, not as the woman who kept him anchored, but as someone slipping beyond his reach. He knew she was already gone in spirit. Love, once their shelter, had become the echo inside empty rooms. She walked to the window and opened it. The smell of wet earth drifted in. Somewhere outside, their son laughed. And for the first time, the sound didn't ache, it healed. That was their real goodbye, no dramatic closure, no performance. Just quiet acknowledgement between two people who had given each other everything possible and still found it not enough. Years later, when the world asked for explanations, Vanessa gave them words that were both poetry and diagnosis. "He loved me like a storm, and I was too tired to keep rebuilding." Each word was deliberate. She wasn't condemning him, she was describing a natural phenomenon, a cycle of beauty and destruction. The storm was not his fault, it was his nature. Her fatigue was not weakness, it was her survival. This is the revelation most love stories avoid, that sometimes the person who breaks your peace is the same person who once saved your soul. That you can love someone deeply and still need to walk away, not because the love has ended, but because you have reached its limit. In the studio that day, after the camera stopped rolling, the interviewer thanked her. Vanessa smiled politely, then looked out the window. Paris was gray with drizzle. For a moment, she thought of all the storms she had weathered, the nights, the silences, the rebuilding. And then she exhaled. Freedom. She realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just the sound of rain without fear. Johnny, somewhere across the ocean, might have felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, that release of pressure. They would always be bound by the years they shared, by the two souls they brought into the world, by the memory of who they were before fame and fatigue took their toll. But now, at last, there was peace in the distance. Their story had not been a tragedy. It was a weather pattern, wild, luminous, and finite. Some loves are meant to transform you, not to last. And when the storm finally passed, all that remained was the truth. They had both survived it, not unscathed, but alive. In the years that followed, their names still appeared together in songs, in memories, in the quiet reverence of those who once believed in forever. But time, as it always does, softened the edges. What remained was not scandal or sorrow, but a strange kind of grace. Vanessa Paradis did not speak of pain anymore. She spoke of seasons. Some people, she once said, arrive like summer, they warm you. They change you. And then they go. You cannot keep the season. You can only be grateful it came. That was how she remembered Johnny, not as the man who broke her, but as the one who taught her the limits of endurance and the beauty of release. Johnny, in turn, carried her in the subtext of his art. Every performance since seemed haunted by echoes of her steadiness, as if somewhere beneath the chaos, he was still trying to play the song she once wrote. Their story became a parable whispered in Hollywood's dim corners about the woman who loved a storm and the man who could never stop chasing it. It wasn't about heroes or villains, but about the delicate balance between passion and peace. The moral was never simple. Love, they proved, is not always a promise of forever. Sometimes it is a mirror showing you who you are, what you fear, what you can no longer carry. Vanessa's departure was not a failure of love, it was its evolution. To leave without hatred, to remember without bitterness, that is a rare art. In her music now, the tone is different, softer. There is room for air, for silence. She no longer sings to be understood, she sings to remember. And somewhere, perhaps, Johnny listens not as the man she left, but as the artist who finally understands the cost of being loved too much. Love, after all, is not about surviving the storm together. It is about knowing when to step out of the rain, look back once, and whisper, "Thank you." Because even the fiercest storm, once past, leaves behind a clearer sky and the quiet knowledge that some loves are meant not to last, but to awaken the soul.